to episode 9 in this series of videos covering AQA's GCSE History Unit, America, Opportunity and Inequality. If you haven't watched the previous videos in this series, I'd recommend going to the hashtag HisTV YouTube channel and watching those videos first. In today's video, we're going to focus on the key question, how successful was the struggle for civil rights in the 1950s and early 1960s? There are 5 key areas that we're going to cover as part of this video. We're going to start by looking at the segregation laws and racial prejudice as context for the growing civil rights movement in the 1950s. We're then going to move on to look at the struggle for equal education and a key Supreme Court decision that paved the way for some more legal change in America. We're going to have a look at the emergence of 3 key civil rights groups and then one of their leaders, Martin Luther King. And finally, then, we're going to have a look at non-violent direct action and peaceful protest and the way that this movement started to put pressure on the American government and society for change. Now, there are 2 pieces of key terminology that I'll be using in this video. The first one is the American Constitution. Put simply, the American Constitution is a document that contains the key laws and principles of American society. And these are the laws that govern all American states. Now, if something is found to be against the American Constitution, we use the word unconstitutional. And again, put simply, if something is unconstitutional, it is a law or an action that goes against the American Constitution, against the laws and principles of American society. So there are 2 bits of vocabulary there that you need to know for this course and that I'll be using during this video. Let's start with a bit of background context for the civil rights movement by looking at the segregation laws and racial prejudice that was found in American society in the 1950s. After World War II, American society was still prejudiced against Black Americans, particularly in the segregated South. If you've seen my video on World War II and the impact on American society, you will know that this was a period of change, but you'll also know that Black Americans, particularly the ones that were posted in the American army to Britain, experienced a society that was not segregated. But coming back to America after World War II, they found that American society was still split, segregated in the South, and there was still racial prejudice throughout the country. Many southern states were racially segregated, and that just means split by race. Things like the Jim Crow laws and black codes were used to ensure that Black people used separate facilities, such as parks, buses, schools, water fountains, swimming pools, different entrances to go into cinemas. But these laws were also used to ensure that Black Americans could not access their rights as US citizens. One of the fundamental rights of a US citizen is the right to vote and to have a say in America's political system. But Black Americans were blocked from voting in some states. Things like literacy tests and intimidation were used to limit Black voting, particularly from groups like the KKK that we've discussed before. And if you take the case of Mississippi, one of the American states, for example, only 5% of the Black population were registered to vote. So clearly the Black Americans were not able to access their rights as US citizens and their right to be involved in America's political system. Finally then, the police failed to stop attacks on Black Americans and often treated them with violence and brutality. As we'll see in my next video, there was a level of distrust between Black Americans and the police at the time. The legal system was also corrupt and almost always acquitted or found not guilty white people accused of killing or lynching Black Americans. So we're going to have a look at how some of these systems changed and were challenged during the 1950s and early 1960s in this video today. So we've covered the context, the segregation laws and racial prejudice inherent in American society in the 50s. We're going to start by looking at the struggle for equal education and the impact that a Supreme Court decision had on American society. Although schools were supposed to be separate but equal, schools for Black Americans were underfunded and the quality of education that Black Americans received was far lower than that of white Americans. In 1896, the Supreme Court declared that American facilities and society could be segregated and split in something called the separate but equal doctrine, which basically said as long as you had equal facilities for different races, it's absolutely fine for them to be separate. But in almost every example, the facilities and the conditions for Black and white Americans were unequal. In 1954, the Supreme Court said that segregated education was not equal in a case called Brown versus the Board of Education. Segregated schools were declared to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, against the laws of America. And so all southern states were ordered to integrate their schools. Integrate means to allow black and white people to come together. Now, there was a slight issue with the Supreme Court case and the decision. The Supreme Court asked the southern states to desegregate with all deliberate speed. And that basically meant that there was no deadline for desegregation. And so in a lot of the southern states, they really, really slowly started to integrate their schools, or some just chose to ignore the ruling by the Supreme Court completely. But at least there was now something in writing that said that separate but equal and segregation was unconstitutional. In 1957, 3 years later, 9 black students tried to attend Little Rock High School in the state of Arkansas. The governor of the state ordered soldiers to stop the black students from attending school. And so as the black students went to go to the school, the soldiers blocked them and stopped them from having an education. Now, this put extreme pressure on the president. The Supreme Court clearly said in 1954 that segregated education was not equal. Segregation in schools was unconstitutional. And President Eisenhower had a choice to make. Does he back the Supreme Court, or does he allow the individual states to continue making their own decisions? President Eisenhower did act. He sent 1,000 soldiers from the National Guard to protect the students and ensure they were able to go to school. Now, these students did attend the school, but suffered abuse and aggression from other white students, their peers, but from also other members of the local community who did not like the fact that white children and black children were being educated together. So clearly the struggle for equal education continued. The Supreme Court was changing the law, but the attitudes of the American people was changing in a far slower way. So we've looked at the context, we've looked at the struggle for equal education and the Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education. Let's have a look at some of the key civil rights groups emerging in this time so that we better understand the rest of the movement in the 1950s. So during the 1950s, the membership of a range of civil rights groups grew dramatically. We'll start with the SCLC, or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, that was formed by Martin Luther King. Now, the SCLC trained civil rights activists, people involved in the civil rights movement, in non-violent protest, how to respond to the police, the law, and the media. We've also then got a group called SNCC, or the SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And this was made up mainly of younger Americans, both black and white students. They took a more direct approach to protesting, but they still avoided violence. And finally, we've got CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality, and they were focused on overcoming segregation and discrimination, particularly through campaigning for better voting rights for black Americans. Now, we'll see that in the mid to late 1950s and early 1960s, these groups worked together, but we'll also see in the next video how differences of opinion led to a slight split in the civil rights movement, and we'll talk about why that was the case in the next video. Now, probably the most famous leader of the civil rights movement, the leader of the SCLC, was Martin Luther King, and he favoured peaceful protest. So let's look in a bit more detail at his life and his experiences. He was born into a Christian family, and he went on to study theology, or the theory of belief in God, at Boston University, and was also a Baptist minister heavily involved in the church. He founded the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and in that group he used religious ideas of acceptance and tolerance in his speeches. This was about bringing people together and fighting against injustice through unity. King believed in something called non-violent protest. He believed that violence should not be used to lead to change, but he was willing to confront violent situations. He knew that in some of the situations where he'd be protesting, he would be experiencing violence from other people. Now, when they encountered violent situations, King encouraged his supporters to respond to violence with peace, by showing that as a group of protesters, they were not prepared to stoop to using violence to try and cause change. Now, Martin Luther King was also an excellent public speaker, and he drew huge crowds. And his I Have a Dream speech, made in 1963, is incredibly well known even today. So we've talked about the context, the struggle for equal education, and the civil rights groups, one of them led by Martin Luther King. We're now going to focus specifically on some of the key events of the late 50s and early 60s and non-violent direct action. So put simply, civil rights groups that were using peaceful protest against injustice and prejudice became known as using non-violent direct action, directly targeting injustice, directly targeting prejudice, but using non-violence or peace as a method of protest. After Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white man on a bus, a group called the Montgomery Improvement Association organized a bus boycott in 1955. Martin Luther King was part of this group, the Montgomery Improvement Association, or MIA, and they organized a bus boycott where they basically refused to use the buses in Montgomery, basically to try and cause change. Now, a lot of Black Americans used the buses to get to work and to get around. And so when they were boycotting the buses, they had to find an alternative method of transport. They're incredibly well organized, and they put together what's called a carpool, where they shared lifts. The Montgomery bus boycott, as a result, caused the bus company in Montgomery to lose 65% of its income. It put massive pressure on the bus company for change. Now, civil rights lawyers also took the case to the Supreme Court, the highest court in America. And in 1956, the Supreme Court declared that the segregation of bus services was unconstitutional. Just as they had done in 1954 with education, they declared that segregation was unconstitutional. And so it became very clear to the American people, both black and white, that the Supreme Court basically declared segregation to be against the laws of America. And so it suggested that segregation in other areas was also illegal. And as we'll see over the coming months and years, lots of other cases were taken to the Supreme Court challenging segregation in facilities. Finally, then in 1960, SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, organized sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. A sit-in essentially is where students refused to leave the white section of a lunch counter. They sat as black students in a white section of a lunch counter, and they refused to move until they were served. Now, some white Americans were also involved in SNCC as well, and so they were also present in the sit-ins, and this group were violently attacked and then arrested. But the sit-ins gained momentum. They spread to other cities, and by the end of 1960, lunch counters had been desegregated in 126 different cities across America. So clearly, non-violent direct action was working. It was challenging segregation on buses, it was challenging segregation in the Supreme Court, and it was challenging segregation in facilities like cafes and restaurants. So that brings us to the end of the video then. We've seen the struggle for civil rights in the early 1950s, leading into the 1960s. We've looked at the context, the segregation of American society. We've looked at how the struggle for education then led to the growth of other areas in the civil rights movement. We've looked at the key civil rights groups, Martin Luther King and his actions and his favor for peaceful protest, and then specifically non-violent direct action. In the next video, we're going to see how the movement continued and how the movement started to split between people who favored peaceful protest and people that wanted change to happen a bit more quickly. Thanks for watching.